Welcome to the Mushroom Show. This is episode 5, and this is the one place you want to be if you want to stay on top of all the cool things that are happening in the wide world of mushrooms. We're going to be talking about functional mushrooms, mushroom technology, mushroom news, mushroom science, and of course, psilocybin mushrooms as well. If you're a fan of the show, it would mean so much to me if you can just hit that like button. Also, if you want to see future episodes, make sure you hit that subscribe button as well and hit the notification bell so you can be notified when new episodes come out. On today's Mushroom Show, we are going to be talking about some things that are in psilocybin mushrooms that aren't psilocybin and how that might play into this so-called entourage effect. But first, let's look at a couple of pieces of mushroom news. Now, if there ever was a zombie outbreak, it might not be caused by a bacteria, it might not be caused by a virus, it might actually be caused by a mushroom. That is the premise of a new HBO show called The Last of Us, which is actually based off of a video game set in an apocalyptic world where the apocalypse was actually set off by a Cordyceps mushroom outbreak. Now, I love seeing mushrooms in pop culture, obviously, and this actually came on my radar a long time ago because anytime we would post a reel or a story or a picture of Cordyceps mushrooms, we would always get people in the comments saying something along the lines of like, oh no, not this again, or I can hear the clickers or whatever, obviously referring to Cordyceps mushroom, the show, and the potential zombie outbreak. So you might be wondering, and I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, could this actually happen? Well, the answer is yes, it could, if we were all bugs. Cordyceps mushroom does actually infect insects, very much so the way it's represented in the show. I guess the show probably puts it to a little more of an extreme. So basically the spores of Cordyceps mushroom will infect these insects, they will take over their body, they will grow through their body and their brain, and they will kind of control them, turning into a zombie and getting them to do their bidding. But luckily, this can't happen to humans, or at least it hasn't been shown to be able to happen in humans yet. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, Cordyceps is a host-specific fungi, so it only is able to infect certain types of organisms, those again being bugs like ghost moths or bullet ants. Second of all, they just don't have the right stuff for the right enzymes to be able to reproduce properly in human tissue. So even if they were to get into our body or into our bloodstream or something, they wouldn't be able to use that and be able to grow into hyphae and mycelium and take over the body like they do in insects, or like it's represented in the show. It's just not possible. Finally, our immune systems are actually very well adapted to deal with these types of fungal pathogens. And this is actually something that we evolved over time because when you think about it, we evolved alongside with mushrooms, and our immune systems needed to be able to fight that off. And we actually breathe in spores every single day. Every breath you take, you breathe in spores, so if our immune systems weren't able to properly recognize those things and deal with them, well, we probably wouldn't have lasted that long. I find it kind of funny that in the show, it's this Cordyceps mushroom that takes over humans and turns them into zombies, but in reality, people actually use Cordyceps mushrooms, specifically Cordyceps sinensis and Cordyceps militaris, to do the actual opposite. It's used for things like energy, for endurance, but also for things like lung health and immunity. So although Cordyceps mushroom is unlikely to cause a human zombie outbreak, mushrooms are pretty wild. So, I don't completely disregard that as a possibility of something else like that happening in the future. Another quick piece of news, Alberta, which is my home province, just kicked off a new set of regulations. On January 16th, they kicked off a new way to regulate psilocybin as a therapeutic agent in Alberta. And this made really big news. There was big headlines, but trying to figure out what was actually going on here really sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole. And to be fair, this is probably something that I need to bring another guest on or another expert to really dig into this. But in the meantime, here's the TLDR on what's going on here. In my opinion, after looking at this, it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal because it doesn't really change anything in terms of access. The only thing it does is kind of apply an extra layer of regulations on top of the regulations that already exist. Canada has what is known as a special access program, which is a program where people can apply to get access to certain compounds that would not be available normally by other legal means, one of which, of course, is psilocybin. But it's not that easy. You can only really apply if all other treatments fail. One example of where this has fallen short is this guy, Thomas Hartle. He's a Canadian. He's a terminal cancer patient who has waited 440 days for federal permission to continue using magic mushrooms. Now, he, to be fair, already had an exemption that was 1 year where he was able to use this for therapeutic purposes, but he hasn't been able to reapply or get the exemption again for whatever reason. It's just been really difficult. So in the article here, it says, in the summer of 2020, the Saskatoon man became the first person in Canada to legally try psilocybin. Age 54, diagnosed with stage 4 terminal colon cancer. And you think he's got probably a lot better things to do than fight with the government over access. And in the article, it talks about some potential issues with this special access program. So Hartle and other advocates say that the program is flawed. Unlike a federal exemption that doesn't have limits on the number of therapy sessions a patient could have, doctors have to submit an application for each single session under the special access program. It goes on, and while Hartle was previously able to legally grow psilocybin and do it at home with a therapist, he now has to spend thousands of dollars flying to British Columbia from Saskatoon, where his doctor is, to receive therapy. He ends by saying what on the surface seems like a granting access actually puts boundaries and borders in place. So this special access program, maybe flawed as it is, it exists. But if we go back to Alberta, it seems like there's nothing new here. And again, it looks like there's just some additional regulations or regulations where there weren't any before that are applied on top of this already existing special access program. As with anything, obviously, there's a couple different ways to look at this. I think the optimist could look at this and say, hey, that's great. They're applying some regulations. This should allow for more people to gain access to these kind of therapies. And, this should be good for the sector as a whole because it's going to make it more available. But the pessimist would look at this same thing and say, well, it's kind of unnecessarily onerous. This is going to be expensive. This puts up barriers, and this is going to cause some difficulties in regards to access for people who want to use these medicines as therapies. So again, a couple different ways to look at it. One example of how this might be gated and might cause issues with access is this idea that a license is required and that they need to appoint a psychiatrist as a medical director who kind of looks over this whole thing. And this other article I was reading here that came out in the Calgary Herald that was interviewing some of these operators, they were saying that psychedelic therapy is kind of stifled by these new Alberta regulations. So it says here in the article, but the operators of some therapy sites that have been offering the treatment say the regulations requirement that a psychiatrist be part of a clinic's team dramatically limits access to the treatment. It says less than 5% of psychiatrists here are willing to be involved in this therapy. So this is David Harder, who operates Atma Journey Center in Calgary, which is one of these clinics. And yeah, there is not a lot of psychiatrists in Alberta, and then an even smaller pool of those psychiatrists might be willing to do this. But maybe it's not all bad. Obviously, the article does continue to say here, if we scroll down, that it's vital to note that the new regulations don't require a psychiatrist to be present at therapy sessions, but the service providers appoint a medical director who is a psychiatrist to oversee all clinically related aspects to the service. So it's not like there needs to be a psychiatrist there full time, which would obviously make this very limited and super expensive, but they just have to be appointed to look over the whole thing. They finish by saying, because the science of psychedelics and therapy is still emerging, ensuring clinics have psychiatrists as medical directors enhances safety. And I definitely agree with this first line. And I think, again, this is something we're going to see. Kind of sound like a broken record on the show talking about this stuff. But at the end of the day, regulating this stuff at scale is relatively new, and not everything's going to make sense at first. And hopefully, eventually, things get figured out. Either way, it will be interesting to see how it all unfolds. On to our next story. Now, you might have heard this term, a cube is a cube, referring to Psilocybe cubensis, and basically meaning that any type of Psilocybe cubensis is the same as any other, or it will have the same effects. A cube is a cube. So even though some people will say golden teacher, which is Psilocybe cubensis, might have different effects than something like Jedi mind trick, which is also Psilocybe cubensis, at the end of the day, they are the same. A cube is a cube, and the difference really comes from the set and setting and nothing to do with the actual mushroom. Of course, many people disagree with this and would say that a cube is not, in fact, a cube. So I wanted to dig in a little bit and see if it's feasible that different strains of mushrooms could have different effects based on potentially the different compounds that are inside of them through something called the entourage effect. Here are some high-level thoughts on that. Now, first of all, the level of psilocybin can vary wildly between different strains, but not only between different strains, also between different mushrooms of the same species, even between different parts of the mushroom. It depends on where the mushroom was harvested, what substrate the mushroom was growing on. A million different things can change the level of psilocybin content in the mushroom, which can obviously have an effect on the effects of that mushroom. And it's not just a little bit of a difference, it's actually a lot. There was this paper that came out not too long ago, I think this was within the last year anyways, and they took a bunch of different mushrooms, not only different Psilocybe cubensis, but a bunch of different psilocybin containing mushrooms, and tested the level of active compounds inside of those. And this is the chart that they had here, and if we look at Psilocybe cubensis, you can see that the level of psilocybin varies all the way down from 0.651 milligrams per gram all the way to 3.509 milligrams per gram. And to be honest, this was a little lower than I thought. I always kind of thought like the rule of thumb was that basically there's 1% psilocybin content, meaning this would be somewhere around 10 milligrams per gram. But still, the important thing to take away here is that is a huge range, right? The difference between 0.651 and 3.59 or 3.509 is basically 5 or 6 times, which can easily be the difference between, kind of a microdose, not really feeling much, to holy moly, this is quite the experience. So just within Psilocybe cubensis and just within psilocybin within Psilocybe cubensis, there can be that wide of a range. So that is a definite point for the different strains have different effects crowd. But they didn't only test different strains in this paper, they tested different species. One of which here is Psilocybe semilanceata, which is also known as the Liberty Cap, which grows wild. If you look at the range here, it's even wider. It goes all the way from 1.28 milligrams per gram all the way up to 11.421 milligrams per gram. So if you picked a random Psilocybe semilanceata or a random Liberty Cap, one could have 10 times more psilocybin than the other one. Again, depending on a number of different factors. But that alone is pretty wild, and definitely I can see why people would think that different mushrooms have different effects just based on of this. But it gets even more complicated than this because psilocybin is not the only active compound in these mushrooms. In fact, psilocybin actually turns into psilocin in the body. Psilocybin is a prodrug, so it gets dephosphorylated, and it's actually the psilocin that crosses the blood-brain barrier and has those effects. So they also measured the psilocin content in these mushrooms, which can vary wildly depending on the species and depending on the mushroom. But there's also these other compounds that we know a little bit less about, or a lot less about, I should say, like baeocystin, norbaeocystin, and aeruginascin. All of these things are hard to spell. Some of them are hard to say, aeruginascin in particular. But, these different compounds potentially could have an impact on the effects of the mushroom. So you think about it, if each different mushroom has kind of a different signature or a different level of all of these different active compounds, well, for sure, maybe that could cause a difference in the perceived effects. Again, this is what people call the entourage effect, or the idea that a cocktail of all these different compounds, depending on the concentrations, could cause different effects. Now, someone who is much smarter than me on these compounds and how they might have an effect on the brain wrote a whole 3-part series on this topic, which you should definitely check out. It's called Do Different Psilocybe Mushrooms Produce Different Effects? His name is Andrew Gallimore. He is a neurobiologist, a chemist, a pharmacologist, and a writer who is interested in the relationship between psychedelic drugs, the brain, consciousness, and the structure of reality. I got a chance to talk to him about this very topic. It was a super interesting conversation, so let's jump right into the interview. Andrew, thank you so much today for joining us on the Mushroom Show.
You're welcome. It's good to be here, Tony. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I am super excited to talk to you because we seem to share a fascination, and it's this. It's the idea that how is it possible that these simple molecules can have such profound effects on our perceived reality? Or I guess more specifically when it comes to mushrooms, how can a little brown mushroom that grows in the wild on cow dung make us question everything that we know about reality? Now, you understand the answer to this probably a lot better than anybody, maybe more than anybody. So I was hoping we could start by just, if you could help describe kind of as simply as possible, what happens when we ingest psilocybin containing mushrooms that causes these effects?
Okay, well, that's a big question, but I'll kind of give you the elevator pitch. So magic mushrooms, they contain a molecule called psilocybin, which enters the body and is converted to psilocin, which is the active component, which actually goes into the brain. Once it gets into the brain, it starts to bind to a number of receptor sites in the brain, in particular a type of serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor. Now, this is heavily expressed in certain parts of the outer layer of the brain, the cortex, particularly in the deep layers of the cortex, these 5-HT2A receptors. And it actually, when psilocin binds to this receptor, it stimulates these neurons. And what this does, we think, is this causes neurons to become more excitable. So when I say neurons, I'm talking about these brain cells that are responsible for controlling the activity of your brain and controlling the world model, really, that you experience. So your experienced world is always being constructed by your cortex, by the outer layer of your brain. And when these neurons are stimulated, it makes it much easier for them to communicate with each other, for information to kind of flow and spread more freely across the cortex, which means that your world model starts to change. It starts to shift from being this very stable and predictable and familiar world to being one that is much more unstable, much more fluid, much more dynamic. So you will get a change in the way that the world appears, basically. It will seem, everything will start to shift and change. The identity of things will start to change before the eyes. And also at the same time, it also makes the cortex more sensitive to incoming sensory information. So the brain starts to lose control both of the world it's constructing and also the information coming into the brain from the environment, which helps to inform that world. So overall, the world becomes much more dynamic, much richer, much more sensitive to sensory information. So it shifts and changes depending on the changing patterns of information entering the brain.
And yeah, that whole idea of world building is absolutely fascinating, and you do talk a lot about that. Hoping to get a little deeper into that a little further into this interview. But the idea of psilocybin, you mentioned it's quickly converted into psilocin. So psilocybin itself is not the compound that's causing these effects, and what is the reason for that?
Yes. Whenever you take a drug, it gets into your bloodstream first. Then, for it to be psychoactive, in other words, for it to actually affect the brain and cause psychological effects, it has to cross this barrier called the blood-brain barrier, which protects the brain really from chemicals outside the brain getting into the brain. In an uncontrolled manner. And molecules that are very water soluble, we call them polar molecules in chemical terms, they find it very difficult. They can't dissolve in this fatty blood-brain barrier to get through into the brain. And psilocybin is very water soluble. It has this phosphate group which is attached to the molecule, and that makes it very water soluble. It makes it very stable, so it's quite stable inside the mushroom. But it can't get into the brain. Now, once it gets into the stomach and also into the liver and the blood, this phosphate group is very easily removed. You have a process called hydrolysis, which removes that phosphate and converts it to an OH group, a hydroxyl group. And this is psilocin. And that is it's still quite water soluble, but it forms this kind of very interesting what's called a hydrogen bond inside the molecule between a nitrogen group and the oxygen, or the hydrogen on the hydroxyl, and that forms this hydrogen bond, and that actually makes the whole molecule much less water soluble and more fat soluble, which means it can actually pass through the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. So psilocin it's kind of a remarkable molecule in that it has this. Structurally, when you look at it, it looks like it should get into the brain. It looks like it should be quite water soluble. But this unique little hydrogen bond, this intramolecular connection, actually helps it get into the brain.
That's fascinating. And speaking of the different compounds in psilocybin mushrooms, such as psilocin, you did write a 3-part series on your Substack that talks about discussing the fact that is it possible for different psilocybin-containing mushrooms or different psilocybe mushrooms to have different effects? And the overall theme is that while it seems kind of like maybe it's mostly a marketing ploy, these things are more so based on set and setting than anything that's going on pharmacologically. But you did seem to leave open the possibility that there might be some sort of entourage effect going on with the different compounds that are inside of it other than just psilocybin and psilocin. So can you talk a little bit about what those other compounds are and the effects that they could possibly have?
Yes, I get into a lot of trouble talking about this because some people are very convinced. And I don't distrust these people. I mean, people say that if I take this psilocybe cyanescens, for example, it has a very different effect to if I take psilocybe cubensis. I don't discount that, but I'm a scientist. So I'm interested in if that is true, if there is an entourage effect, by which we mean when you have multiple compounds together and they modulate each other's activities, you get a different overall effect in the brain. So I'm interested in how that might work. So there are a number of chemicals, as you said. So if we think about how is psilocybin made inside the mushroom, it starts from an amino acid called tryptophan. This is then converted to tryptamine. Then you get the addition of this OH group, this hydroxyl group. This takes you to something called norbaeocystin, basically, which is one of the compounds which you find in mushrooms. Then you can add a methyl group, so a carbon atom, onto the norbaeocystin nitrogen, and that gets you to baeocystin. Then you add another methyl group, and you get psilocybin. So it's this stepwise process from norbaeocystin to baeocystin to psilocybin. You can then add one more in some mushrooms, but not many. Methyl group, one more carbon atom to get something called, and I can never pronounce it, aeruginascin, I think is the pronunciation, something like that. So you actually got 4 main compounds in there that are of interest pharmacologically, in my opinion. So they are found in different levels in different mushrooms. So each mushroom tends to have something of a chemical signature, an alkaloid profile. So there you have, straight away, you have a possibility that different levels of these compounds, if they have different effects, might lead to an overall different effect of the mushroom. However, it's not as simple as that, because the problem with these other compounds is that we aren't sure if they can actually get into the brain. And this is what I was analyzing in my Substack posts, was to think about how do they compare to psilocin, which we know gets into the brain because of this hydrogen bond, this connection in the molecule that I spoke about. And it seems like both norbaeocystin and baeocystin can actually form this hydrogen bond as well. So I'm reasonably open. I think the evidence is quite good that both of these molecules can probably get into the brain. Aeruginascin has 3 methyl groups, which gives the nitrogen a positive charge. So this is getting a bit chemical, but it's kind of you kind of have to explain. So this one, aeruginascin, certainly can't get into the brain in that state. Or very, very unlikely. Very, very unlikely. It's possible with certain molecules, even if they are very water soluble, that they can use specialized transporters, protein transporters, to get into the brain. That's a possibility, but there isn't really any evidence for that. So overall, we don't know pharmacologically, chemically, neurologically, if these other molecules, apart from psilocin, can get into the brain. And if they can get into the brain, whether they have the same kind of effects or perhaps slightly different effects to psilocin. Now, it's possible that even if they are not on their own psychedelic, let's say baeocystin, for example, even if it isn't itself psychoactive or psychedelic, it could actually, by binding to a different pattern of receptors in the brain, actually modulate or affect the effect of psilocin. So again, you might have this unusual effect where you have a group of molecules interacting together with only one of them actually being psychedelic, psilocin, but is actually modulated perhaps by the others. So there's a number of possibilities, I think, that might explain the the anecdotal reports of an entourage effect. But going back kind of to your original point, every psychedelic experience is very different. So without a well-controlled study, it's quite difficult for someone to say, "Oh, I took Psilocybin cubensis last week, and it was a very non-visual and very philosophical." In a headspace experience. Then 2 weeks later, I took Cyanescens, and it was very visual. Therefore, Cyanescens is visual and cubensis is non, or something like that, because every psychedelic experience is going to be different anyway. So you have this confounding factor of the inherent variability in all psychedelic experiences. So unless you get lots of people in a properly controlled formal study where they don't know which type of mushroom they're taking, for example, and they have to describe their experience. What is the visual quality, what is the psychological quality, and all these different things. Then we might get a better picture.
I would postulate that it might even be difficult for people to compare different psychedelics, not only different strains of mushrooms. So it might be difficult to tell. People might be primed to have an experience on LSD or versus psilocybin, but they might actually be very similar experiences at the end of the day. One thing I did want to dig into quickly, and I'm not sure if you have any insight on this, but you mentioned number one, the difficulty in studying these things, but you also mentioned the idea that, and I pronounce it aeruginascin, but I agree that's really
aeruginascin. You're probably closer than me, to be honest.
Well, I only know that because I spoke to someone who's looking at this very deeply, trying to figure out this whole idea of wood lovers paralysis, which I'm not sure if you've heard of before, but this is the idea that some mushrooms can cause a paralysis. And some people thought this was just kind of like, a myth. It doesn't really happen. Some people say, no, it really does happen. And they came up with this idea of the aeruginascin hypothesis, which is basically that aeruginascin, and I forget the exact mechanism of action, but it can somehow cause this paralysis effect. So would that not imply that it can cross the blood-brain barrier, or we're just not sure?
Well, not necessarily, because you can get peripheral effects that could affect the musculature or protect the. So you have obviously you have your central nervous system, which is your brain, and your spinal cord, which is protected to some extent by the blood-brain barrier. But you also have your peripheral nervous system as well, which is outside the brain, and so it's possible that this aeruginascin, there we go, is. I'm trusting you on that. This aeruginascin is affecting the periphery. It's affecting peripheral nerves, peripheral neurons, rather than ones inside the central nervous system. So it doesn't prove, unfortunately, that it can cross the blood-brain barrier, I don't think.
But I guess, using that same argument, though, could you say that some of these compounds in mushrooms, even though they don't cross the blood-brain barrier, is there any possibility that they're, and I'm not an expert in this area at all, but using something like the gut-brain axis or some of these, neurons in our gut that people talk about, the second brain, is it possible that that's where some of these effects are coming from?
I'd be very reluctant to make judgments like that. I mean, people do like to make those connections. I mean, certainly, that the brain is a unified system to some extent. The brain is always speaking to the body, and the body is always speaking to the brain. So certainly, you can affect the brain indirectly by affecting the peripheral nervous system, but I think without some really good studies that would look at that, perhaps by selectively blocking receptors outside the brain and seeing how that affected the experience. I think we have to remain circumspect and not make any wild judgments on what might or might not be the case there.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a good approach when studying anything, even something as hard to understand as psychedelics and the effects that psychedelics have. One of the things your article mentions as well is the recent discovery of beta carbolines in certain species of psilocybe mushrooms, and which beta carbolines are commonly associated with ayahuasca, which obviously has some different effects. Can you speak to the idea that, perhaps the beta carbolines are responsible for some of these different effects or some of the entourage effect that we know?
Yes. Again, this is another one. So this paper came out in the last few years, which showed that they had identified these beta carbolines, like harmine and harmaline particularly. So as you said, these are the MAO inhibitors in ayahuasca that normally come from the ayahuasca vine, Banisteriopsis carpi. And these inhibit this enzyme in the gut called monoamine oxidase, and in the liver and the blood, that break down DMT rather quickly, which is why you can't take DMT orally. Now, they can also potentiate the effects of psilocybin. So if you take psilocybin and some ayahuasca vine or other form of MAO inhibitor, monoamine oxidase inhibitor, that would also enhance and potentiate the effects of the psilocybin. However, it's all about dosage. So it's all about how much beta carboline have you actually got in these mushrooms. Now, the problem with modern analytical chemistry is that, well, not the problem, the beauty of it is that you can find many things that you couldn't have found 20 or 30 years ago because they're extremely sensitive. So you can discover what we often call analytical concentrations of something that are very, 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 very tiny that you simply couldn't see. And of course, in the paper, they said maybe the beta carbolines are, because it's a good headline, right? Maybe it's like prepackaged ayahuasca where you've got the psilocybin in there and you've got the beta carboline to inhibit monoamine oxidase. Unfortunately, when you actually look at the data that they got, the levels were so vanishingly small. It turns out to get a standard dose of beta carboline that you would get in a normal dose of an ayahuasca brew, which is about 500 milligrams, you'd need to take tons of dried mushrooms, which that's a heroic dose, as I say. That's so it's simply a normal dose of magic mushrooms, even a heroic one, 5 dried grams or 10 dried grams. The amount of beta carboline that you're going to get in those mushrooms is so vanishingly small, sub-nanogram levels. It's simply impossible that it could have a pharmacological effect. So unfortunately, that idea is largely discredited, I think.
Yeah, and of course, dose is very important. And that, I guess, leads to another point. One of the recent research papers that you reference in your article is this one that compares the different levels of all these compounds in different mushrooms. And part of what it talks about is the difficulty in studying this because there's the age of the specimen, where it was harvested, all of this kind of stuff. Can you talk a little bit about the range of concentrations of psilocybin or some of these other potentially psychedelic compounds in mushrooms and how that could potentially have a large effect on the experience that people are having?
Yes. So, I mean, when people report or there's kind of an often quoted concentration of psilocybin in mushroom. If you take Psilocybe cubensis, you will get around 10 milligrams per gram, which means that 3 grams will get you about 30 milligrams of psilocybin, which is a good solid psychedelic dose. Unfortunately, as you point out, levels in the mushroom can vary dramatically depending upon growing conditions, depending on which flush even the mushrooms came from. How were they dried? How are they stored? So you have multiple factors. The mushrooms themselves can have very widely varying, often 6 or 7 fold, at the top and bottom end. So it means that 3 grams of dried mushrooms, assuming they were perfectly dried and perfectly stored, 3 grams might be a very mild dose with like maybe 10 milligrams of psilocybin, or it could be something of a heroic one with 60 milligrams of psilocybin.
Right.
And then when you factor in how they were dried and how they were stored and that kind of thing, it becomes even more difficult to judge, to predict the effect of the mushroom. Which is why I always suggest that if you're growing mushrooms in yourself, that you should harvest them, put them all together, dry them all in the same batch, and then perhaps grind them and gel cap them or something like that, or homogenize them in some way, so that when you've had one dose, you kind of get the feel for that particular harvest, rather than taking one mushroom for one particular flush, or that kind of thing, because you might find they actually vary quite a lot. But when it comes to scientific data on this, it's extremely difficult. Often these mushrooms aren't even properly identified, which a paper found recently that many of these specimens that were found in these botanical collections they weren't the mushroom that it said on the tin, so to speak. It was a completely different species. So you have to take all of the published literature, even on alkaloid content of mushrooms, with something of a pinch of salt. It's a very messy literature, and very difficult to say, given a particular sample, what the alkaloid content will be, and what will the alkaloid profile be. What concentrations of the different molecules, psilocybin, psilocin, baeocystin, etc., will be in there.
Now, this seems to be one of the arguments for this idea of synthetic psilocybin, which they're using in a lot of these clinical trials and a lot of psilocybin therapy. And I just wanted to briefly get your opinion on that. What is there a difference broadly between using like whole dried Psilocybe cubensis, for example, versus a synthetically produced psilocybin?
Short answer is no. Assuming that there isn't an entourage effect. Now, if there is an entourage effect, of course, if there is an effect of baeocystin, norbaeocystin, etc., then the mushroom experience might be qualitatively different. It might be a different experience. Taking the fresh mushrooms or the dried mushrooms versus taking pure psilocybin. But for most people, for most of the time, it's the psilocybin converted to psilocin in the body, of course. That's the key psychoactive, psychedelic component. And of course, because of all these problems in standardizing concentrations in mushrooms, for clinical studies, when you want to give someone a precisely measured dose, you want to give someone 30 milligrams, you don't just give them 3 grams of dried cubensis and hope for the best. You have to make sure that your dose is correct. You don't want to underdose them, and you certainly don't want to overdose them. So I think, for most people, of course, who are using these mushrooms for their own personal use, you don't need to go down the route of getting pure synthetic psilocybin. But for therapeutic work and for more formal scientific studies, I think it's essential that you use synthetic or at least isolated psilocybin from mushrooms. I mean, that's again the same thing. There's no difference between psilocybin that's been made in a laboratory and psilocybin that's been extracted and properly purified from mushrooms or yeast. Even you can even have yeast now produce psilocybin for you, which is a very good, quick, and high efficiency, high volume way of producing psilocybin. I think that will be transformative, both in science and in the clinic, but also in ultimately it will escape the laboratory, so to speak. Rather like, oh, I won't say that. I was going to say, no, I'm not going to say. It will escape the laboratory, and fall into the hands of people who want to produce psilocybin very, very quickly by these genetically engineered yeasts that you could, there will come a time, I think, within the next few years where making psilocybin beer will be, you will get some water and dissolve some sugar in it and then add this special yeast and wait a few days, and then you will have a nice magic beer. There's something to think about.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I heard you talking about that on another podcast, and that's the first time I've heard of it. It's just like, wow, the implications of that are pretty staggering.
Yeah,
I did want to shift gears just a little bit into this idea of world building, just because it's something that you talk about a lot. And it seems like it's something you think about a lot. And I just think it's such a fascinating area to think about when we're talking about psilocybin mushrooms and their effects. And, one of the things that got me thinking about this was actually listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson on Joe Rogan. I don't know if you saw that episode, but Joe Rogan was basically
I can't listen to him, no. Yeah.
Okay.
I can't listen to Neil deGrasse. I love Joe Rogan, but I can't listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Totally fair. I think a lot of people share that sentiment for whatever reason. And I think after watching this clip, I was kind of stunned because he was basically asking him about the idea of mushrooms. And Neil deGrasse Tyson was saying something along the lines of, I don't mind people saying that they've been to Venus, implying that they've had these experiences where they've gone places, but is what you experience part of an objective reality that we all experience? The brain is capable of such extraordinary thought within itself, and what I care about for the world is what is objectively true. If it's not, if it's only true within your head, it's not useful. But this, I was listening to you talk about this idea of world building and how actually incredibly difficult that is and how much of a miracle it is that we can even produce these worlds. So I just wanted to ask you, is there an objective reality? Is that even a fair statement? Or do we just have a chemical soup in our brain and there is no such thing as objective reality?
Well, I don't know what objective reality means. I mean, certainly the world that you experience, even Neil deGrasse Tyson's wonderfully impeccable, lossless experience of reality isn't is still, he's experiencing a model of the world. We never have direct transcendental access to whatever there is out there. What Immanuel Kant would call the noumenal realm, the noumenon, the world beyond the senses, the world as it is. We never have access to that. The world that we experience, whether we are in normal waking life, whether we're dreaming, whether we're at the peak of a DMT trip or a psilocybin experience, the world we experience is always underlined a model that's being constructed by your brain. Your brain is a world builder, as I always say, right? Your brain is this miraculous piece of world building machinery that has this remarkable ability to construct a model that you experience from information, from patterns of neural activity, that happens to be adaptive and functional and useful as a model of the environment that allows us to navigate whatever there is out there, to find a mate and successfully reproduce. Yes, this is an evolutionary thing. There's no way to say that this world that we experience is somehow true. Or somehow the real thing, so to speak. All we have access to is the model that works. And I think what Neil deGrasse Tyson doesn't appreciate is that his reality is just like all of our realities, is that it is this model, and that when you take a psychedelic drug, you are altering the model. That's what you're doing. You're altering this constructed model, this world built by your brain. It's no less real. It's not a distortion of reality. It's just a different model. It's an altered model. Yes, it might be less functional. It might be less adaptive. It might not be mapped to the environment, to the that outside world, whatever it is, in the same way. But it's still built from the same stuff. There's no qualitative change in what that world is built from when you take a psychedelic drug. It's still the model. It's just an altered version of the model. So all worlds that you experience are equally real in some sense, in that they're all built from these patterns of neural activity, which has this quality of subjectivity. But some are more useful than others in terms of, survival and that kind of thing.
Right. And I totally agree with that sentiment. There is no such thing as objective reality. Everything that we're experiencing is some sort of interpretation of what's going on that, we're somehow interpreting it in our brain. And, Terrence McKenna actually had some really good, he's got a way with words, obviously, and he explained the same idea in a way much better than I ever could. But I did want to get your opinion on it, because you do talk so much about world building. And I think it's such a fascinating idea, like how our brains are able to do that. But speaking of that, you do have a book that you just released called,
Yes.
And I have it right here. Can you talk a little bit about that? It's called Reality Switch Technologies, and it talks a lot about these ideas of world building. So maybe talk about your book, really.
Yeah, so the book is Reality Switch Technologies, Psychedelics as Tools for the Discovery and Exploration of New Worlds. So it's a book that talks about world building. It's basically, in a nutshell, it's a deep and thorough explanation of how psychedelics work in the brain, how they interface with your world building machinery of your brain, and how they change the structure and dynamics of your world, allowing you to explore and navigate and other realities constructed by your brain. So these could be, these immensely bizarre and complex DMT world, for example, or it could be the salvia worlds that you go when you smoke salvia divinorum, or it could be the world you go to when you take high dose ketamine. So basically, the purpose of the book when I wrote it was to take somebody who was not a scientist, but somebody who's really interested in how psychedelics work, and take them through the chemistry, through the drug receptor interactions, how that affects neurons, how that affects the patterns of activity, how it affects that global world building machine of your cortex, and how we can use them to actually to explore alternate versions of this world model. So it's available now from my website, alieninsect.net, or from Amazon or any other good bookstore, and some not so good ones as well, I think.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we'll have all the links to that in the description of this video, buildingalienworlds.com or alieninsect.net. Also, at alieninsect on Twitter. You have you're such a good follow on Twitter, because you always have these really in-depth threads that just make you think, and a really great job of explaining these very complex topics for people to understand. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave with your audience before we land this plane here?
Yes. So as you said, I post. I'm interested in not just kind of researching and thinking and writing about psychedelic, but also in kind of communicating their importance and trying to dispel a lot of myths and help people develop their own understanding of the science and the neuroscience and the chemistry and the pharmacology of these. So yeah, that's why I post a lot on Twitter, Alien Insect, but also I have a Substack which comes out every week where I go more deeper dives into psychedelic neuroscience and that kind of thing. So that's Alien Insect on Drugs is my Substack. I think.
And I will say, actually, finally, I did mean to mention this, but you also have a master class on YouTube, which I discovered, which is unbelievable. I can't believe I've never seen that before, but it's really in depth, and it's a lot of information to take in, but it's like a university level course on all of this stuff, basically.
Yeah, so 8 units. Can't remember how many videos, about 40 videos, something like this. But I take. It doesn't need to be you don't need to be a scientist to do it, but I think it's probably the most comprehensive course available anywhere, and it's all for free on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, Alien Insect again. So please, spend some time with that if you want to really learn about how psychedelic drugs work in the brain.
Amazing. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us on The Mushroom Show.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I hope you enjoyed that. Andrew is such an absolute wealth of knowledge when it comes to these different compounds, not just psilocybin, but all of these different psychedelic compounds and how they affect the brain and what they're actually doing and how they help us create worlds which is a super interesting topic. I highly recommend you go follow him on Twitter. If you use Twitter, he's a great follow. He writes all these awesome threads that are super interesting and super easy to break down. But also go check out the Substack where that 3-part series is on. Do different psilocybe mushrooms produce different effects. And for sure, go check out his masterclass on YouTube. I will put the links to all of those in the description below, so you can go ahead and check that out. On that note, I'm going to check out from this episode. Again, thank you so much for watching. And if you like mushrooms, if you like The Mushroom Show, please hit that like button. It really does mean a lot. And if you want to see future episodes, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can be notified when future episodes come out. So again, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.